Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Fioravanti. Welcome to the 2022 All-America City Awards and GLR Week 2022. I'm a senior consultant to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, or CGLR. And before we begin, I wanted to share a few logistics seen here. Please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and location. This session is being recorded and live streamed. Bios and slides for today are available on the All-America City website in the agenda tab and will also be sent after the session. And I'll put that link in the chat in a minute. We encourage and invite questions from all of you. Please post those in the Q&A box in Zoom, and our moderator will pull those out for discussion in the latter part of our session. You can go to the next slide, thanks. This webinar anchors two virtual conferences taking place this week. One is the GLR Week 2022, and the other is the 2022 All-America City Awards. GLR Week is a week-long series of virtual events organized by CGLR's network of state lead organizations that will spotlight how dozens of states are working to advance early school success and accelerate equitable learning recovery. GLR Week also features the following daily plenary sessions that lift up and explore the transformative potential of emerging bright spots and silver linings coming from the pandemic. Plenary sessions are seen here, and you can go to our conference website at the bottom of the screen to learn more and to register. We also encourage you to connect and engage with us on social media, and all the ways to do so can be found here. And I'd now like to introduce my colleague at the National Civic League, Rebecca Trout, who will briefly share more about the All-America City Awards before we dive into today's session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jill, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this kickoff session of both the Campaign for Grade Level Reading Week as well as the National Civic League's 2022 All-America City Awards. As Jill mentioned, I'm the program director of the All-America City Awards, and I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of background about both the League and this year's awards. So the League is a 125-year-old nonprofit, and we really aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. We do this in three different ways, primarily through community assistance, that's direct on-the-ground support to communities, research and publications where we lift up best practices around civic engagement, good governance, innovation, and then of course our awards and events, which is why you're all here today. So the All-America City Awards is our flagship program. It began in 1949 to really lift up, celebrate, and recognize communities who are experts in using community collaborations and engagement to solve local issues. A little bit about this year's awards specifically. We are co-convening this year's awards with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and as such, we're focused on housing as a platform to promote early school success and equitable learning recovery. We had applications from across the country submitted in March around this theme. They went through an extensive peer review and external review process. We celebrated the 20 finalists in May, and they've all been really preparing for this week's event and competition, and they'll be presenting to a jury of national experts later in the day, tomorrow and Thursday. Here's a list of this year's finalists. You can learn more about them on our event platform. You'll see from the map that they are diverse geographically and population size, and of course in the issues that they are all facing in their local communities. Wanted to just lift up a couple of other sessions throughout the week. Later today, we will have our official kickoff of the All-America City Awards with our opening ceremony. You'll hear from the leadership of both the League and the campaign. And then we're lucky to be joined by Deputy Secretary of HUD, Adrian Todman. On Wednesday, we have a little bit more of an interactive session for you. It's our roundtable learning exchange, where attendees will be broken down into different groups depending on the focus areas of this year's theme. So things like digital equity, parents succeeding in their own journey, relational supports, that sort of thing. And then we'll have some supplemental award announcements and hear from the mayor of Austin that evening. And then our final day of the event is Thursday. We will close off with our closing ceremony. That's where we will name this year's 10 winners, and then we will hear from the new president and CEO of the Kettering Foundation. So I encourage you to tune in for that. That's always an exciting event. And then last but not least, I just want to encourage you to tune into finalist presentations. These communities have been working on these presentations for months. They should be great. They will be streamed on this Facebook page if you're watching here on Facebook. You can kind of see the schedule both on this slide, and then of course that's on our event platform as well. And now I'll hand it back over to Jill.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just a little background before we jump into the session on housing as a platform. So from the campaign's inception in 2012, we have recognized that what happens outside the classroom is essential to ensuring that children are set up for early school success. This includes an intentional focus on parents and investment in 24/7, 365 multi-generational systems of supports for children and families. Public and affordable housing organizations are critical partners in the work to meet children and families where they are, particularly those that are the most economically disadvantaged, marginalized, and disenfranchised. The importance of housing as an anchor institution extends to other sectors, including health and the environment. Also core to the campaign's approach is engagement with philanthropy at all levels. All of the more than 350 GLR coalitions around the country are supported by local funders, and advancing collaboration between local, state, regional, and national funders is a core component of our work. These themes and more will be discussed today, moderated by Jeanne Fekade-Sellassie, Executive Director of Funders for Housing and Opportunity. After 2 decades of working in the affordable housing and community development sector, Jeanne joined FHO in 2017. Joining Jeanne are 4 distinguished speakers. As Vice President for the Environment with the JPB Foundation, I can go to the next slide. Dana Bourland works at the intersection of issues related to health, poverty, and the environment, and led the creation of the Environment Program at JPB. Charles Rutheiser is a Senior Associate in the Center for Community and Economic Opportunity at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Monica Valdes Lupi brings more than 20 years of experience in public health to her role as Managing Director of the Kresge Foundation's Health Program. And Dana, Charles, and Monica all serve on the FHO Executive Committee. And providing commentary is Schlonn Hawkins, CEO and publisher of Shelterforce. Schlonn brings a background in both local philanthropy and early school success to her current role. And I will post a link in the chat to the website on the All America Cities platform where you can access bios and this complete slide deck. With that, I'm going to turn the session over to Jill.
Thank you, Jill and Rebecca. It is really an honor to be here to help kick off the All America City Awards and to have this time with others who understand that where a person lives really matters. As Jill said, I'm Jeanne Fekade-Sellassie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Funders for Housing and Opportunity, or FHO. And I'm here to say that housing matters. FHO is a national funder collaborative that started from this place of understanding that where a person lives really does determine the opportunities that person has in all aspects of life. Housing stability affects a person's mental and physical health, their academic achievement, their economic mobility, their job success. It has climate and environmental impacts, and the list goes on and on. And I'm also here to say that there are populations for which housing hasn't led to better opportunity. Black and brown families have been disproportionately left behind by our nation's historic and contemporary racist housing policies and practices, which have meant that BIPOC families have had limited housing options, which then limits their access to good schools, to uninterrupted learning environments, to healthy food options, to public transportation, to clean air to breathe, and on and on. But I'm also here to say that this lack of access to opportunity that Black and brown communities have experienced acutely is not a failure of one siloed system. It's not just a reflection of the housing system or only the education system or only the health system or only the criminal justice system, but it's a combined failure of aspects of multiple systems over a sustained period of time. And that, in a nutshell, is why FHO was created. Our members recognize the foundational nature of housing and all of its varied intersections, and they recognize that a systemic problem requires a systemic response. And our response has 3 parts: policy change, narrative change, and a change in how we collaborate across sectors. Can you advance the slide, Rebecca? And this is how we've sort of structured our work. At the bottom there, the foundation of our home is centering racial equity and repairing harms. The next level up, but still part of the foundation, is a focus on severely cost-burdened renters and people who are unhoused, those we think of as precariously housed. And then our first floor, if you will, of our house has 3 different rooms, and they represent kind of our tactics moving toward our vision. So that yellow pathway shows our first funding priority, which is policy advocacy and organizing. The green is our next funding priority, which is promoting productive messages about why housing matters. And the third is that blue pathway, what we call elevating what works, which is to promote local collaborative solutions. And kind of like the carpet of the second floor, that base for the floor, is to make sure that everything we do is grounded in place and community voice. And then on top of that, we have kind of a second floor, 3 rooms, which represent the impact of our investments. So our policy advocacy and organizing work, that yellow pathway, we hope will protect the rights of renters and increase funding for affordable housing. Our narrative change work, or the green pathway, will build public and political will in support of those policy solutions. And then our elevating what work priority drives cross-sector solutions. And finally, that roof is our vision for what our world would be like once we've achieved this goal, that renters have access to safe, stable homes they can afford in communities that support better opportunities, which are free from the barriers and harms of systemic racism. Next slide. And luckily, there are lots of foundations who believe that this vision is worth working together toward. These foundations, I think that the animation is a little slow here, but you'll soon see 13 member foundations that work together collaboratively, both in grant making, but also as a learning community. And this collaborative effort allows our members to meaningfully amplify their impact. It allows us to build power, force, and voice that we need to solve this big problem that we've taken on. And so we've invited 3 of our members, Monica, Dana, and Charles, to talk to us today about how they see the intersectional nature of this work and why it's important to do it together. And then Schlonn is with us to offer perspectives from her experience as a funder, as a practitioner, a leader, and a community builder in the field, and now as someone who runs a community development media outlet. So I'd like to remind you again, as Jill said, to please use the Q&A function instead of chat to ask your questions. We'll save them to the end, but please feel free to offer your questions whenever they occur to you. The first theme that we'd like to explore with our panelists is the intersectional nature of housing. And I'd like to start with Monica. Monica, can you tell us a bit about how you see the intersection of health and housing, particularly for children, and why housing stability matters?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Jeanne, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share some of our work. From the Kresge Foundation, in terms of the intersectional nature, I think you did a great job describing the impacts of health inequities that result from housing instability. And so we know that we often hear, especially in families, that if you are in housing conditions that have pests, mold, mildew, they're going to be triggers for health chronic diseases like pediatric asthma. When you're living in housing or homes that are in unsafe neighborhoods, and you walk out the door and you see violence in a persistent chronic way, and you're exposed to violence in unsafe communities, that's going to impact one's health. And so definitely from our perspective at the foundation, that's where we see the direct impacts of housing conditions on health. Jeanne, are you asking each of us to go through our slides? I'm sorry, before?
Yep.
Or, okay.
Go ahead.
And so, that first slide, sorry. So on that first slide, that just is describing how we see housing in terms of our overall portfolio. Jeanne already did a great job in terms of describing how we know that where we live and when housing is affordable, accessible, and safe, that's going to impact one's health. I'm going to highlight a couple of examples from our Advancing Health Equity Through Housing initiative. And that's work that we're doing on the health program at the Kresge Foundation that's looking at community-driven practices that connect housing and the health sectors, and also recognizing some of the things that Jeanne described in terms of the multi-sectoral partnerships that are necessary to protect, preserve, and increase the supply of safe and stable housing to improve health in low-income communities around the country. So next slide. So one of the examples that I want to highlight, and I noticed that Atlanta is one of the finalists in this initiative, is work that we're supporting with the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. This group is the largest provider of pro bono legal services in Atlanta, and they provide education, advocacy, and representation at no charge to low-income families for legal questions, legal needs. Through their Stand With Our Neighbors program, full-time attorneys and advocates are embedded in schools and neighborhoods with the highest eviction and pediatric asthma rates, school enrollment and poverty, and they work with families to improve living conditions, housing stability, and health. One partnership that they wanted to make sure that I highlighted for all of you is work that they're doing with the Thomasville Heights Elementary School in Atlanta. At the school, more than 90% of their students, there are 500 students in this elementary school, lived in an apartment building with really terrible conditions, boarded windows, floors, mold, mildew, what I talked about, which really triggered the cases of pediatric asthma among the residents. They began piloting a program with the school administrators who were facing a lot of challenges because half of the students at the school were transitioning in and out of school each year. Suspensions were high, and it contributed to really low academics performance in the school. So the Atlanta lawyers and the foundation started working directly with families to address these housing challenges and respond to and resolve the problems that families were facing. And they began to see some improvements. They have a lot of work to do, but they've been able to improve academic performance, and they've been able to bring on board other partners in the city to enable them to scale their work. So they've got multiple healthcare partners, health systems, they've got corporations like Home Depot and other law firms that they've engaged in their collaborative efforts. They've also been able to help in terms of the apartment building where these families live. There are new owners there that have invested $30 million in improving the complex, and now they're making sure that the residents who are there aren't unnecessarily or inappropriately displaced because of these improvements that are going to happen. They've been able to scale their work in 8 additional schools in the city. And I also included the last bullet, a new program that they started in terms of bringing mobile advocacy into the neighborhoods to help with families that are experiencing intimate partner abuse. Next slide, please. The second example that I wanted to highlight was work and support for the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. This is a partnership that resulted out of a decision that was held that HUD, the federal agency, had violated the Fair Housing Act because they were concentrating African-American public housing residents in the most impoverished, segregated areas in the city. As part of that work, the partnership was created, and they're a subcontractor of the Housing Authority in the city of Baltimore. The partnership addresses many of the health inequities that I've already highlighted, but including preterm births, infant mortality, and violence. And they couple this work that they're doing to address health inequities by providing counseling with housing choice vouchers to enable families with young children to move into healthier housing in neighborhoods of opportunity. The housing choice vouchers, if you're not aware of them, this is a federally funded voucher program that enables very low-income families to rent housing in the private market. And so recipients who are part of this program are able to get support for their leases. Healthcare partners in this work that the Housing Partnership is doing in this city play a critical role because they're screening patients and they're asking them about their home situation and whether they're interested in moving into safer housing. And if a family is eligible, the clinicians have a referral mechanism in place to couple them with counseling services, and families participate in different workshops to help them as part of their pre-move counseling efforts. So it's really, they go into this counseling program, they're able to lease in private rental markets, and then the housing partnership, once they're able to move into different neighborhoods, they actually continue to support families by ensuring that they're able to maintain their tenancy. They make sure that they're connected to care that they need with their healthcare providers, and they work with the families in terms of assessing their home environments and housing conditions throughout their participation in the program. And that's my last slide, Jeannie.
Thank you. Those were some great examples. I'm wondering, Charles, if you can tell us how Annie E. Casey Foundation sees the connection between housing and youth and family well-being, and talk a little bit about the work it supports to that end.
Thank you, Jeannie. I'm very happy to do that. The Annie E. Casey Foundation is not a housing foundation. Our primary mission is to create brighter futures for children, young people, and families. But we also recognize that housing is a basic fundamental need that is interconnected and bound up with a whole set of life outcomes. And without housing stability, it's very difficult to have any of these better opportunities and outcomes. I mean, we know from looking at the research and evidence base that more stable housing leads to greater family stability. It is connected with stronger ties between children and parents, even if they are incarcerated. Housing roots people in place. It is the prime connector of opportunity. It can be, help sort of build the social fabric of the community. If people are not stable in their housing and there's always moving, it's very difficult for people to develop and maintain these really strong relationships with each other and be able to more effectively advocate for their needs, interests, and priorities with the public and private sector decision makers. We do know that housing stability improves educational outcomes, and as Monica mentioned, is connected with improved health, both physical and mental, for children and their parents. And also, if you are paying too much for your housing, paying more than 30, or in many cases for extremely low-income households, more than half of your income in housing, it leaves very little to be able to spend on other fundamental basic needs like food, healthcare, as well as the amenities that are, part and parcel of a decent life. And, we work at both a national and a local level. And in particular, the two prime localities where we're involved are our two hometowns of Baltimore and Atlanta. We are a supporter of ADLF as well, Monica, and we were one of the sort of early funders of BRHP as well. And we're also interested in trying to identify some other localities where we might be able to work at that level with local collaboratives and local funders. Next slide, please. So these are our primary goals and investment areas in our housing work. One is to improve housing and stability for low-income families, whether they be tenants or homeowners, and to ensure that and to minimize eviction, foreclosure, and the displacement that occurs as a result of gentrification. We're also focused on increasing the production, preservation, and access to affordable housing. And then thirdly, we are also focused on ending and preventing youth homelessness. And we work towards these goals by investing in a series of areas. One, in policy advocacy, and supporting, local, state, and federal policies that really help achieve these goals. We also provide capacity building support for nonprofit and community-based organizations and some public entities as well. We invest heavily in research, in collaborative funding like FHO, and a variety of peer learning and action networks. And then for the last 2 years, like many of our colleagues around the FHO table, we've been also investing in the response and recovery to COVID and the impact on housing, and particularly the acceleration of housing instability and increases in homelessness.
Thank you, Charles. Dana, It's your turn. How do you see the connection between housing and climate or environmental justice, especially as it relates to the well-being of children?
Yeah, thanks, Jeannie. And it's terrific to be here and just really enthusiastic about our collective recognition of the importance of housing at JPB. We see housing as a basic human right, which it has been declared as one by our HUD secretary. So we take this very seriously, given our mission at JPB to advance opportunity and justice in the United States. We see this as an issue of justice, that everyone have housing in the United States that they can afford. And for us, you know, housing justice, climate justice, environmental justice are very much intertwined. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit more about the work that I'm helping to lead within the JPB Foundation around the environment. Like Monica and Charles, the JPB Foundation doesn't have a housing program per se, but we see it as fundamental to absolutely everything we do. As it pertains to environmental justice specifically, there is a principle among the 17 environmental justice principles that were put together by the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. And that 12th principle reads, environmental justice affirms the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up and rebuild our cities and rural areas in balance with nature, honoring the cultural integrity of all our communities and providing fair access for all to the full range of resources. And so housing is inextricably connected to furthering that principle of environmental justice. You can go to the next slide. And I'll just say, you know, at JPB, we really start with where do people live? And for that, that means looking at what kind of housing do they have access to? What is the condition and quality of that housing? And you may all be well familiar with the Thoreau quote, what good is a house if you don't have a planet to put it on? And, you know, we see these issues connected, that we have to think about housing and planetary well-being together, and pursuing housing justice and climate justice as one, as we meet the tremendous need of both, as we're facing both the housing and climate crises in this country. You know, these issues are so connected, as Charles mentioned, that low-income households spend 3 times more than moderate income households on their utility bills alone. And so we know what that means. Not only are we mostly demanding, you know, sort of dirty energy for that electricity, which has its own climate impact, but it's an unfair burden on low-income households to be paying more just because of the quality and condition of the housing stock they have access to that is affordable. And so we also, JPB looks at the interconnection too between the toxic stress of a child and their caregivers, as it relates also to the stress of not having access to housing that we can afford, that's prepared for the impacts of climate change. And so we know these very real traumas of having to move multiple times as a household is looking for housing that they can afford, and or more recently, looking for housing that will not be flooded or be in harm's way when it comes to these horrific wildfires that we're seeing raging across the country as a result of the climate impacts from drought. So, you know, again, very connected issues for us. A real example, you know, also being children who have been exposed to these climate effects. A grantee of ours in Austin, Texas, spending time educating us on the impact of just rain events, just normal rain events now in schools, teachers needing to close the blinds in the school classroom when it rains, so that children can remain focused on their education while these traumatic events for children occur on a, you know, seemingly regular basis as rainfall does occur. But yet for children who've been in massive weather events, extreme weather events, rain is no longer just a benign event for them. So it has real repercussions on their education. And Monica covered the health impacts, which, are very real. 22 million households make emergency room visits each year just for asthma. And so as we're needing to stay in our home, whether it's for the pandemic or during these extreme events, that means that we are more exposed to mold, to pests, to other triggers for asthma, and a growing increase for these triggers of asthma. It can be attributed to our building materials in the home. And so JPB has spent a lot of effort investing in organizations that are helping to make us a transition to healthier, cleaner, affordable materials, so that we're not needlessly triggering asthma or exposing children to long-term health effects that come from these known carcinogenic products like flooring and paints and different cabinets. For us, this means also really investing once and for all, is my hope, in removing exposure to lead, which is still a significant exposure for many children. And as we know, that has a tremendous impact on their ability to learn and their IQ levels. And so that for us is connected again to these issues of housing justice and environmental justice. So, what matters for us at JPB is that if we're going to be investing as we need to meet both our housing and our climate crises, we have to do it in ways that both improve the health and well-being of the people living in the homes, as well as the homes themselves. And as this slide shares, if we don't, the outcomes are going to continue to be greatly inequitable, that we are going to continue further burdening households for the utility bills that they must pay and the consequences of not being prepared for climate change, for further pollution indoors and outdoors of the home that has significant impacts on a children's ability to learn and thrive. And again, we have a long road ahead to really prepare all of our homes for the continued impacts of climate change. So that's a little bit about how we're thinking about this intersection between housing justice and climate justice and environmental justice, which for us are all inextricably interconnected.
Thank you, Dana. Schlonn, what do you think? What reactions or observations do you have as someone who kind of has a foot in both camps? One, as a former state lead of a grade level reading effort, and now representing affordable housing.
How much time do we have? No, what I really appreciate from all the panelists is this thread that, housing definitely matters. And, even the name of this particular webinar, Housing as a Platform, there's so many things that we can derive for that. But I like to always, remind my staff and remind folks that we're talking to that it is definitely foundational. That there's, when I think about the program that I ran in Delaware, children, families, if there was no stable housing, there was no education, there's no parental engagement. There is such a strain on the school system. And so it is so monumental and so important for the communities and for communities to thrive. So I'm happy to hear that everyone is, definitely underscoring that. But more importantly, as someone who is now on the flip side, talking about, the publication and elevating the voices, what I really would like to know from those that have just spoken is, what is your particular organization? What are you doing to actually to connect the dots and to actually fill the gaps of information? There are so many folks that are, whether you are leading this fight, organizing, tenant organizing, advocacy, or you are, sitting in the office making decisions around strategy, around community development or housing justice, or whatever the case may be. The folks that really are important in this, and I like to think the families and the children are always at the center of all of our decisions. sometimes don't have the information. So what is your organization doing to help to fill that gap, to elevate elevate the stories and to help folks to connect to this cause? Because like you said earlier, it takes all of us to do it. It's not just one particular sector. It's not just the schools. It's not just the families. It's not just the foundations. It's not just legislators. It's all of us working together. So what are you doing to help to connect the dots?
I think we have time if any of the panelists want to respond.
I mean, I love the question, and I'll be brief in my remark and just saying that what we're trying to do at JPB is invest in communities who have already connected these dots. You know, I think sometimes it's us in philanthropy who have created, you know, somewhat siloed programs. And what we really appreciate about the Funders for Housing and Opportunity, it gives us a chance to come together across silos to break those down for ourselves at our respective institutions, while we fund organizations working on that ground level, as Jeanne shared, the house, you know, that are based in community, because moms and dads and grandmas and families have connected these dots because, you know, in our daily lives, these all kind of become just how we need to live. And so that's our approach at JPB, is to find organizations working in communities, listening to the needs of those families, and invest in what they need to make progress on these intersecting issues of housing and health and climate.
Thank you, Dana. Charles,
and from you know, Casey, you know, invests a lot in local, state, and national networks that link different groups together. So, for example, in Baltimore Renters United and the Community Development Network of Maryland have been those sort of, you know, intersectoral, you know, touch points around housing. You know, supporting FHO and the work that it is doing, you know, through policy advocacy and organizing, supporting the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's Opportunity Starts at Home, which is this vast intersectoral network that tries to bring not just evidence, but experience from the grassroots to build, you know, consensus around, you know, the importance of advancing housing. So I think there's a bunch of things that we're doing, and also, you know, the importance of listening to community, and also especially to young people. And making sure that they have voices around the table and being able to influence the systems whose decisions affect their lives. So, for example, in the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, there's a requirement for a youth action board. And in both Baltimore and Atlanta, we're supporting those efforts, helping to provide stipends to young people, as well as coaching to enable them to be the most effective you know, leaders and influencers within those domains which they have been historically excluded from.
You know, the last thing, just really quickly, that I jump up and jump into an ad that wasn't shared yet. We met recently with one of our housing grantee partners in Miami Worker Center. And I think what you said, Schlonn, is so true in terms of the work that nonprofits are doing. And they want us from a funder perspective to connect the dots, because at Kresge, there are multiple programs that are supporting oftentimes the same community-based organization or nonprofit. So being good listeners, as Charles has said, but also us getting out of their way, because they know best, because they have community members who are part of Miami Worker Center. So providing them with general operating support, multi-year grants, so that they can do the work that they need to do on the ground, where they're not only working on housing, but they're working on community safety, they're working on economic development, worker rights, and reproductive justice. Those are the issues and challenges that their community members are facing. And from a foundation perspective, I think our role is to support them and giving them as much flexibility and as much time that we're able to within our rules and constraints at the foundation to allow them to do the work that they need to do on the ground.
Thank you. Great question and response, Schlonn. And it leads us right into our next topic that we wanted to be sure to cover today, which is really about why collaborative work matters. I'm going to start by asking Charles, as one of the founding members of FHO, kind of why did philanthropy decide to come together in this way? And kind of what has kept you coming to the FHO table?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think also it was one of those sort of, moments where there were a number of foundations that I think had recognized the importance of housing, but that and where housing wasn't necessarily a central part of our grant making or programmatic things, and the recognition that we could not work alone to make the kind of change that we want to see, and that we needed to collaborate and align ourselves in a more effective way. And in some cases, it was we could have the same grantees, we supporting the same grantees without necessarily the awareness, intentionality that we're all working together and trying to sort of align what we're asking our grantees to do rather than pulling them in 12 different directions. And it's been an amazing experience over the last 6 years to be able to sort of talk with my colleagues and peers, some of whom have much deeper experience in housing than I do, to learn from them. FHO has been really important in helping Casey as we've refined and revised our housing strategy. And I learned something every time I participate in an FHO meeting, whether it be the group of the funders or the convenings that we pull together of our grantees and partners. It's just been I think a very, very high and consistent return on engagement.
Thanks, Charles. Dana, from where you sit, from your perspective, what's unique and important about philanthropy working together? And are there sort of any cautions you might have about working together as
There are some cautions, but I think they're vastly outweighed by, really the importance of working this way. At JPB, collaboration is just built into sort of our DNA. That's how our president got us started. And so, I think what's unique and important about that way of working is that we all kind of improve together. We learn together. And I think Monica mentioned this, the more, we foundations, as they say, you meet one, you've met one foundation. We are different. We have different purposes, different missions, and I think that's helpful and necessary. But there could be more things that are streamlined in a way that would actually be beneficial to the communities that we're all serving, and we're, I think oftentimes have a shared end goal. And so coming together through something like the Funders for Housing collaboration, an opportunity is that we learn together, and we might be able to then go back to our respective organizations and collectively make some changes that advance the philanthropic sector in a way that we wouldn't be able to do as individual organizations. And it really does, maximize that collective voice that we can have together, which is so important. We just can't continue doing this alone. These issues have become way bigger than any one foundation can manage. I think the caution is just leaving behind sometimes both the individual and the institutional constraints, and realizing that we're in a space where we can shed some of that and do more together and have a bigger impact. So I think that's the caution always is, I try to show up to meetings and leave that baggage behind. I'm not always successful at doing that because, we're all passionate about our individual grants and organizations that we're supporting, but remembering that collectively we can do so much more together, and we need to. And, we're, I think, really looking to bring other funders into FHO for that very reason, to continue helping us learn different perspectives, different ways of working. And we are a nimble collaborative, which I think is a real unique attribute, to FHO, that we learn and we change, and we're always getting better.
Monica, Charles and Dana both spoke from sort of a national perspective. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you see from your grantee partners about the importance of working collaboratively at the local level and the importance of kind of supporting that community-driven work that Schlonn was asking about earlier.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention in my intro that the work that we do at the foundation at Kresge, we have 4 priority cities where we, across the teams, do a lot of hyper localized investments. So Detroit, Memphis, New Orleans, and Fresno. And then as a national program, you know, I highlighted some of the examples in other cities, but regardless of whether it's in the 4 focus cities or in other parts of the country, we hear from our grantee partners that all the work is local, right? That in terms of housing, it's one of those challenges, even when I was in a local health department, where the relationships really matter. And that's what we hear from our grantee partners. There's so much need. And because there's so many systems that you highlighted, Jeanne, that impose so many challenges and barriers, there's not one sector that can fix it. So what we hear from grantee partners is the importance of working not only with other community-based organizations and nonprofits in communities, and the need for philanthropy for Kresge to recognize that they often have to compete for those resources and to be aware of that. So when we're able to put out resources that allow and facilitate them to partner with each other and in non-competitive ways, they've shared that back with us. They have to work with their housing authority, with their elected officials, with their county administrators, with city councilors. And so being able to work across those sectors and to build and foster those relationships is something that we hear consistently from our partners. And then the other thing I would say, because we are funding 29 organizations across the country, the other thing that they've asked us as a learning is, and then this next round of our work with our initiative is to create opportunities for them to share and do this peer-to-peer learning. So I think Charles and Dana, we provide resources to our grantee partners where we're trying to provide technical assistance and help build on their community assets and strengths. But there's something to be said about learning what other people are doing in other communities. And I'm in Atlanta today. I work from Boston, and what might work in Atlanta might not work in Portland, Oregon, or in San Antonio, Texas. But even just learning from each other, I think, can inspire and sort of make those connections to figure out new ways of working on housing challenges in those communities. So I think those are some of the things that we've learned in terms of what our grantee partners are saying in terms of supporting these really hyper-localized initiatives that they're spearheading.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Schlonn, I'm curious what your reflections are on this topic, particularly as you've sat both kind of at roles, sat in the role of local philanthropy and how you see that connecting to national philanthropy. And does this kind of raise any new questions or new ideas for you?
Just listening to Monica and actually, you know, hearing what the grantees are saying quickly takes me to my days of starting Get Delaware Reading in Delaware, and how adamant I was to say, like, we have to have this program around for 2 to 3 years, you know, because of the people are so used to organizations coming in and really having great intentions. But really, it's like sort of these pop-up shops, if you will, of service, and then it goes away after a year. And so communities, families are jaded, they're apprehensive. And so it really is about relationships and trust. And that's hard. And that's not something that you can quantify. And so sometimes when you're applying for those dollars with the different foundations, you're sitting there scratching your head trying to figure out, how do I show this? How do I display this? How do I get the foundation to understand how important this is? And so, I always, when I talk about, the relationships with foundations, I always say, I don't want this relationship to be transactional. Like, this has to be a partnership. I don't need you to swoop in for 1 to 2 years, because nothing is going to change in 1 to 2 years. I need 3 to 5. If you're really committed to change in the community. And then on the flip side, when we talk about affordable housing, and what's going on in the community, it's the same. People have to take the time to be invested. We always talk about investments, but what is your definition of investment? What does that really mean? And really, the way that you show that you're invested is really with the dollar. And so we just, and it's just so hard because, I'm on this line, I'm teetering between, being hyper local and then being national and elevating these stories, because I think it's so important. That's how we connect the dots, is actually sharing the story, sharing the information, helping to fill that gap of information at Shelterforce. But it's a challenge. It definitely is a challenge. But I would just say that I think the direction that we're going, even though it's hard, because we have more folks that are transitioning into the housing justice field, because they want to be a part, they have to do something. We just have to be a little bit patient with one another, really have that honest conversation, and really lead by example, and really have some empathy and really compassion for people. People can, always tell if this is a transactional or if this is really a partner, in this fight, if you will. And people want to know that you're in the trenches with me, that you really care about me. So that's why it's important for the longevity, for the resources. And I love what Monica said about getting out of the way. There's a lot of organizations that are hiring Black and Brown individuals to lead these initiatives on the ground. And I would just say, we're more than capable, and to get out the way and let us do the work, because we have the relationships, and to trust us. And so I can go on and on and on, but I will not. And I will leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if Monica or Dana or Charles has a response to anything you heard Schlonn lift up.
My audio and video froze for about 30 seconds, so I missed the last bit of what Schlonn said.
Well, I would just agree with what you're saying, and yeah, I don't have anything to add, because what you said is true and exactly what we all are working towards. And so I just appreciate you lifting it up and reminding us how important it is for us to trust and get out of the way and be there for the long haul. Certainly what we try to do at JPB, we also, the majority, if it's not 99%, it's pretty close of our grants are 3-year, multi-year, or longer. And I think we're, as philanthropic entities, all trying to move more to general operating support and be listeners and enablers, not the ones who say how things need to be and put up a lot of obstacles.
I think too, what the pandemic has shown philanthropy is that there are new ways of doing things. We don't have to be tied to the 1-year grant cycle or grant reports or grant applications in the traditional way. That giving operating support is much more valuable in most cases than project support. And I feel like during the pandemic, a lot of foundations shifted temporarily to try things in different ways that they hadn't before, and are seeing that, gosh, that actually works. Why don't we keep doing it that way? So we have the pandemic to thank for some shift in thinking, I think, in philanthropy. Dana, did you come off mute because you wanted to say something?
Only to, bring it back also to, to the conferences that are intersecting, which we're sort of focused on, cities and communities and children and education. That I think is also what we're trying to do a better job of, is understanding that these issues are interconnected and finding ways to use our resources to enable the most interconnected, holistic, integrative solutions that improve both the conditions of where people are living, but also, the ability for children to thrive. One of the things I meant to say in my opening remarks is when I started at JPB, President, this is in the interview process, even as I was applying for the job, said to me, what good is it if Jane can read if Jane can't breathe? And, so I think also what we're seeing through our experience in the last couple of years is just how important it is to advance these solutions that have so many benefits, not just being single issue or single focused.
Thanks. We do have some questions in the Q&A box. We're going to go through those now. So if anyone else has questions, please add them. There was a question about how to get a transcript. I think that that's been answered, but we'll answer live now. One question was, how do you connect your work on housing with work to combat homelessness? And I'm going to ask Charles, because he's probably closest to this work, that particular type of work, to respond.
Yeah, thanks. The housing field is notoriously fragmented, in many different ways. And then the fragmentation between the housing sector and the homelessness sector is very real and unfortunate. And sometimes, these are happening in completely different kinds of conversations and so forth. And I think one of the things that we see as rather critical, and I think also you take a look at what Funders Together to End Homeless is doing, and really, sort of shifting their focus to housing justice and thinking upstream and thinking about, preventing the circumstances that lead people to be homeless in the first place, I think is a good example of how there are efforts underway to sort of bridge those kinds of artificial functional divides that have bedeviled the field. And in the case of NE Casey, we're very much focused on youth homelessness, because it is one of the young people between the ages of 14 and 24. There is a very significant number of young people who are homeless each year. I mean, Chapin Hall back in the late 2010s released their Voices of Youth Count project that showed that each year and this is prior to the pandemic, 3.5 million young people between ages of 14 and 24 were homeless for some period of time. And that includes, both sheltered and unsheltered, and then most significantly, those in between who might be couch surfing or double or triple or quadrupled up, and don't necessarily meet the standard of definition of homelessness in HUD parlance or in local continuums of care. You take a look at McKinney-Vento, which shows that, there were 2 million young people living with their families homeless each year. And that this is just a very large number of people. And we do know that being homeless, and especially also, couch surfing, there was a recent research report out of San Mateo County, California, that shows that educational outcomes for, young kids whose households were couch surfing had educational outcomes almost as bad as those who were either sheltered or unsheltered homelessness. So that it doesn't make a difference whether or not it fits the formal definitional criteria of a particular sector or agency. These kinds of precarious housing situations have a very debilitating impact on young people, their opportunities, and their overall life outcomes. And also, if you experience homelessness as a young person, it greatly increases the likelihood that you are going to be homeless as a young person, as an adult. So I think and this is, I think, one of the things that's going to be really hard, is to work to build bridges across, a set of actors and agencies that have for decades been separate. But, given the fact that funders are in a position, one of the things that we do have is in providing resources, being able to convene, build bridges, and, reinforce these kinds of connections that would not necessarily happen without intentional effort.
Thanks, Charles.
Can I just add on, Jeannie, because
Yes.
100% agree with everything Charles said, and again, just why there's such a connection to these issues with climate justice, as people are experiencing homelessness as a result of these extreme weather events. One of the links I provided in my slide was to Climate Central. We've been really paying attention to mapping where households are that are at risk for these extreme weather events, so that we can prepare those homes for those impacts before they happen, so that children and their family members do not have to experience homelessness. But we are seeing this climate migration, as it's being called, within the United States, from community to community, from state to state, region to region, occurring at a much greater pace. And I think it falls on us within philanthropy and all the sectors represented here today to address both of these simultaneously.
Thank you. We have another question here about, do any of your foundations have specific requirements for your awardees to partner with minority contractors, or to have a quality of life support component for their work? Do any of you require that?
We don't require, we encourage that. And in many cases, certainly in our anchor institutions work, which we, did for more than a decade, that was one of the key, emphases, trying to get, universities, hospitals, and other institutions that were, rooted in place to be able to support local minority businesses. And, that, at least prior to the pandemic, was increasing rather significantly year on year amongst those anchor institutions. And as far as quality of life indicators, certainly when we approach, performance measures for our grant, we do try to have as wide a range of indicators that, work across these different domains of life. But I think, this is also important, not just in our grant making, but our social investments. And the last couple of years, I've been working very closely with our social investments team as we, choose new entities for program and mission related investments, and really trying to up our game in the impact measures, not just counting, housing units, but in particular where we're investing in entities that provide supportive services as part of affordable housing, tracking the educational, health, and social outcomes that come from those ancillary or additional supportive pieces that fall under the rubric of housing's platform.
Thanks for the question. There's another couple more questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to read them just so we have them for the transcript. So this person was a community organizer in the early 90s, fighting for these very same issues. And yet here we are still fighting this fight. Not to minimize the work of those who are truly trying, but this is a war on the poor, and cities, states, municipalities do not seem at all interested in putting up the real fight. Housing is not being built for those truly in need, especially when policies are being created that are harming income-challenged peoples and families, such as the steadily increasing median income, where 100,000 annual income is considered low income, anti-tenant screening policies, the ever-disappearing housing stock, etc. Where do the funders see their role in the political cat and mouse game?
I can start, but I can't wait to hear what Dana and Charles have to say. So we were actually having this conversation today, the different leads for our program teams at the foundation, in that I think what the question is raising a larger issue around community organizing and power building on multiple fronts. And how do we do this? And I will, for full transparency and disclosure, we do not have an explicit democracy initiative or program at the foundation. And yet what we're trying to figure out is that so many of the challenges, not just housing, climate change, climate justice, reproductive justice, all of these issues require much more intentionality in terms of supporting community power building and organizing. And how do we do that in a way that's more coordinated? So I don't have an answer for the question that is posed, only to share that it is something that I think we're struggling with in terms of how do we not only coordinate, but make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences in terms of what we're doing with and hopefully with the communities leading the way. I don't know, Charles or Dana, if you have some insights to share on that front from your work that you're leading.
I actually was going to ask Jeanne to share, because I do think the work that FHO is doing on the federal policy and the state and local policy is super encouraging, as well as our major investments in organizing and advocacy. You know, JPB does focus on democracy. We do heavily invest in organizing. We've been doing that more and more. I think I love the question because, yeah, we have to fundamentally change the narrative around how we view housing in this country, from sort of the asset commodity based conversation to it is a fundamental human right, and we're not producing or preserving housing at the pace that we need to. And of course, I would add, and we're not doing that in a way that is advancing climate action as well. So, you know, yes, we're trying to do better. Questionnaire, but Jeanne, maybe you could share.
Yeah. So some of the work that Funders for Housing and Opportunity funds, when we were created, we really were thinking about the supply of affordable housing. And as we've evolved and listened more to what tenant organizing groups were wanting, what they're really interested in is protecting tenant rights, right? Making sure that they have right to counsel in eviction proceedings, making sure that there are safeguards against eviction, or greater time to prepare if an eviction is going to be filed, or just like regular old landlord-tenant relationships. Like, my apartment needs some maintenance, like holding landlords accountable for that. And so we started to fund more groups that are organizing around those tenant kind of rights. And when we first started funding those groups, we heard across the board like that tenant landlord issues are local issues. There's not really anything we can do at the federal level. But now many groups are organizing to get a tenant bill of rights at the federal level, with maybe even an interagency council being created, we hope. So there's, I think there is movement. It's encouraging. FHO funds both these kind of more grassroots efforts and also more of kind of the national advocacy groups, because we think both are important, and we think the both should kind of work together and open kind of their lines of access and share power. So that's the kind of work that we fund at FHO in our policy place. And it's also, I think, one of the values of a collaborative effort is that we as FHO can fund that, even if some of our member foundations are not able to fund policy work. So that's also kind of, I think, a benefit of collaborative funding. Monica or Charles, anything to add? Okay. The next question is, are there good examples of communities in which residents are involved in helping to guide these efforts? A few come to mind for me, so I'll take the privilege of lifting up Kansas City Tenants, the Miami Worker Center. There's a collaborative effort in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and one in Piedmont, North Carolina, that stand out to me as places where places that we fund where residents are really in the driving seat. There's many more examples. And this came through as an anonymous question, but I'd be happy to talk offline if the person who asked that question wants to, have a follow-up call. Monica, Dana, Charles, anything you want to add, or Schlonn, where you see this working?
In Baltimore, I think we have some, through Baltimore Renters United, which was just created last year, and we were one of the catalytic funders in getting it up and going to be able to sort of really organize, helping tenants be able to mobilize and have an impact on the decisions of the city, both in terms of emergency rental assistance, but also in focusing on the issue of just housing on affordability. I mean, Baltimore is not the luridly booming housing market that say a place like Denver or Boston or San Francisco or LA, but we've had very little affordable housing constructed over the last decade. And we have an inclusionary housing ordinance that just expired, but it had been fairly toothless because developers were able to opt out through payment of fees. So we've had thousands of units of very high-end luxury market apartments being constructed, and virtually none that are focused on the half of Baltimoreans who really struggle with their ability to make rent. So we're very excited about BRU and the way in which the city is beginning to really respond and listen to them in a way which they have not done previously.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to give some examples, and happy to, like you, Jeannie, connect offline if the person asking is interested. But 3 other examples to just lift up other places in the country where the tenant organizing is front and center in the grantees partners work include Chicanos por la Causa in Phoenix, Connecticut Fair Housing Center, which is in Hartford, and then the Third Homes for All, which is in Jackson, Mississippi. Those are just 3 that I know. There's a very strong tenant organizing component in terms of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, and I would just lift up Right to the City,
Yes.
Which is a great tenant organizing, community organizing network across the country. You can go to their website, righttothecity.org, and actually see a map of their member organizations, and it names them. There's terrific work happening in so many communities. I think that's what keeps us all going. It's hard to name just 1 or 2, but that's a good resource for those who are interested.
I'd just like to interject real quickly for those that are interested. Shelterforce does a really good job of highlighting different communities that are doing the very thing that you're asking the question of. And so I'm not trying to do a shameless plug, but I'm just thinking about all of the articles and topics and resources, even what Charles was talking about in Baltimore. Some of the tenant organizers used our article to actually push the initiative forward around renters' choice, and Baltimore's mayor actually vetoed it in legislation. So, there's resources out there, and Shelterforce is one of them. And so I can go on and on and on, but we do a really good job of actually highlighting different communities and what different communities are doing, especially when we talk about like renters actually taking sort of that power building. So there's a couple of articles around that where, there are renters that are actually, coming together and creating, investments, and, so there's, owning their own neighborhoods and communities. So there's some resources around that as well. And then coming in the fall, where Shelterforce is doing a whole series on tenant organizing. So if any of you all are interested or have comments or thoughts or questions or things that you'd like to see in that series, you're always welcome to submit those to us.
Thanks. Maybe in the chat you could put how folks submit, how they can find you if they have ideas about things to submit. Alexis had a question. Is there a learning agenda for the Funders Collaborative that includes learning to align with other affinity groups, perhaps around Justice $40, disaster relief, funding organizers, and so forth? So yes, FHO has a very intentional kind of focus on understanding all the sectors that impact housing stability outside of the housing sector. So we do, we have, like, each of our meetings, we have kind of listening sessions there. We had one and how it impacts housing, and we talked about Justice 40 there. We also work with funders together to end homelessness, which is an affinity group for funders who care about homelessness. And we're working with them and to try to be a resource to other, what they're called philanthropy serving organizations. So other groups that where like philanthropy can sit around a particular issue. And our purpose with that is to really try and be a resource for PSOs whose members are starting to think about housing, so we can help them kind of understand what we know works, and what the more productive frameworks are, what folks in the field are working on, and what we're hearing. And so, those are folks like Grant Makers in Health, Neighborhood Funders Group, United Philanthropy Forum, Council on Foundations. Those are the types of groups that we're working with in that respect. There's another question. I see they are building a lot of luxury housing with high prices. What can the government do about it? Can you imagine one bedroom is $1,800 in Massachusetts, and they're not going to low-income people? One thing that can be done, I don't want to answer every question, but one thing that can be done is around inclusionary zoning, where builders are required to set aside a certain percentage of units in their new properties for low-income tenants. Also trying to preserve what's called naturally occurring affordable housing. So affordable housing that, or housing that's affordable but isn't subsidized. There's an effort to keep that at a place where people can afford it. Are there others on the call who want to add? I mean, there's specific policies. There's a great website that I'm forgetting right now. I'll put it in the chat when I remember it, that talks about all the different policy levers that can be pulled, and laws that could help with the affordable housing, like building of affordable housing. That the Furman Center, I'll think of it and put it in the chat.
Yeah, and also when it comes to inclusionary housing, making sure that it really has teeth and that there aren't these very easy opt-outs that enable, developers to, really just go about their business and, pretend as if, these regulations aren't there. But, now, we've seen over the last 2 years, dramatic increase in housing costs, dramatic increase in materials and material costs, really, I think does, challenge the historic ways in which, housing has been built. Overall, reform of zoning, especially around density, is something that could, but I don't think there's a one sort of magic bullet, right? Or magic bean that can be, or policy lever that can be pulled that will enable us to, respond effectively to a challenge that has really gone, uncontrolled, for years, if not decades.
Oh, thanks, Charles. The website I was referring to that I just remember is localhousingsolutions.org. For some reason, I can't put it in the chat, but I sent it to Jill, who can put it in the chat. If people are looking at like really what cities can do. There's a question in the Q&A box about how do folks here see the connection between housing and literacy? I don't know that that's an issue that many of that these three members work on exactly, but does it intersect with any of your work?
I think I can, I don't know if the person can share a little bit more detail, so I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this question correctly or fully. So we know that from some of the responsive grant making that we did during COVID, that we worked with our housing partners to make sure that community health workers were there in terms of raising up health literacy and understanding about testing options, quarantine and isolating. And we know that, they were very confusing and continue to be confusing guidance that, local, state, federal health departments were issuing early on in the pandemic. So that's an example from a health literacy perspective and the role that community health workers played in terms of meeting tenants and meeting community members in their neighborhoods to raise awareness and to share materials in the right languages and at the right literacy levels.
I would just say, when I was the director of Get Delaware Reading, it was at the height of the pandemic. And so everyone was home. So trying to really connect the dots between, folks being at home and literacy. And prior to that, like I mentioned before, we understood that if the home's not stable or if the community is not stable, children just were not learning. And it was definitely hard. It created a barrier between education and the children, and really trying to nurture that parent engagement. But really in the height of the pandemic, when everyone's home and trying to infuse literacy, folks just had to get really creative. So there was a lot of literacy programming that made it accessible. And I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make, making literacy accessible, and really doing that by going in the communities and providing literature, books, providing packets. We did packets every week for children to keep things going in regards of learning and literacy. And then we also relied on the volunteers of the community. So there's a program that actually happens that's still going on, where there are folks that are volunteering to read every week. And it's available on social media, so parents could actually sit down with their children and their children can be read to during that time. So those are a couple of things that come to mind when I think about housing and the connection between it and literacy.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat, which the answer is probably going to be unsatisfactory. I'll say that up front. But the question is, we have groups that want to we have groups that want to register voters with our housing residents in Texas, which is very important in Texas, where registering to vote and voting is ever more challenging. Our housing services staff don't have the bandwidth to support this effort, given funding restrictions and limitations. Are any of the funders supporting this kind of work in Texas? Dana's nodding. Go ahead, Dana. Maybe she will have you.
Yes, it's going to take me a minute though to remember. I'm wondering how to connect that person to some good resources, but yes, the answer is yes.
Okay, so it shows up for me as anonymous. If the person that asked that question wants to just put their name in the chat and put like Texas question next to it, so we can find you again with your email address, that would be great. By and large, foundations are prohibited from funding voter registration, but what we can do is fund general operating. But it sounds like Dana might have some groups in Texas that would be helpful. Yeah. I see a poll on my screen. Does everyone else see the survey already? Okay. I think that might be a cue that it's time to wrap. So I'm going to pass this over to Jill to wrap us, but I'd like to, first thank all of you for joining and your really excellent questions. Really appreciate your engagement throughout this entire session, and to thank you to all of our panelists for, bringing your whole self to these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we wrap, I wanted to see if I could maybe ask the panelists, maybe as a closing, just one last question, because I think we have time maybe for one quick 30-second response, because there was a very good question that didn't quite make its way to the Q&A, but I think that's very relevant. So the question is, what tangible strategies are foundations using to lean into trust-based philanthropy, and ways in which you are considering your work beyond the dollar? So maybe just to close out, if each of our four speakers, and Jeanne, it'd be great to have your input on this too, maybe you could just give a quick response around how you're looking at trust-based philanthropy, because I think thematically that's something that's really come through today.
For those who aren't familiar with what trust-based philanthropy is, it's really about ceding power and decision-making to the people who are experiencing the problem that you're trying to solve together. And so there's lots of ways to do that. And I think philanthropy is becoming more aware of this model and moving along the continuum toward more trust-based or restorative, regenerative philanthropy from a more extractive place. For FHO, for us is did our grant application and it like as streamlined as possible. And in fact, what we do in most cases is just a short letter of inquiry followed by a community conversation where we just talk with people, and we also kind of look at every single word in our grant application and in our reporting to see, like, are we really going to use this information? And is this language inaccessible? Like, do people know what it means when we ask about capacity building? Like, what does that really mean? So it's both about language. It's about making our processes as least burdensome for the applicants as possible. And then to figure out ways to be in real relationship with our grantee partners. That may mean down the line we get rid of reporting altogether. If we really are in relationship and we know what's going on, we may not need them to submit formal reports. Maybe we can write those for them. It may mean that we get to a point where we have like a community of advisors or community consultants who help us with strategy so that we think about where we're headed differently. That really informs the work. Other foundations get, there's some that are way out ahead of the rest of us who are actually giving pools of money to communities and saying, we'll get out of the way, as Monica said. Go ahead and figure out how you'd like to use this money. And all of the decision making is given to community members. So that's kind of the continuum and where FHO falls on that. Charles, Dana, Monica, Schlonn, anything you want to add?
I mean, I just want to underscore that I think that's great. I think, that it could be a little nervous on the other end, like when you're running the foundation, trust is a very delicate situation, but definitely needed. I think that, it brings me back to, communication as a whole. It's two-way communication always. It's not always about what we want. It's really about who's receiving it and what they need. And so I really love hearing that there are more foundations that are moving in that direction, because the programs that I've seen that worked actually really do partner with the folks that are experiencing it and actually are leading it on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Just as we close out, I want to once again thank all of our speakers today. Jeanne Fekade-Sellassie as our moderator, Dana Bourland, Monica Valdes Lupi, Charles Rutheiser as our speakers representing FHO and each of their own foundations, and then Schlonn Hawkins, who comes to her work at Shelterforce with a background in early literacy and also local philanthropy. So this has been just a stellar group to bring together. As we close out, Rebecca, if you could just put the slides up, I just want to do a quick reminder that this session is serving two purposes. It's lifting up work that's being presented through the GLR Week and the Campaign for Grade Level Readings annual conference. So if you're interested in learning more and participating more in sessions like this, strongly encourage you to go onto our conference website and register for other plenary sessions that are going on this week, and also looking at the map of activities across about 15 or 18 to 20 states around the country that are lifting up early literacy and early school success at the local and state level throughout this week. And then the next slide, please continue to connect and engage with the campaign through our social media, our hashtags, our @signs, our LinkedIn profile, etc. And then lastly, wanted to again remind you that this is kicking off All America City Award Week, which is being hosted by the National Civic League and co-convened this year with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. You can see we have an opening ceremony tonight, a really interactive roundtable learning exchange tomorrow, and events happening each evening, including our opening ceremony featuring Deputy Secretary Todman, and then our closing ceremony where our winners will be announced. So really encourage all of you to not have this be the only time you interact with the campaign and with the All America Cities this week. Thank you again to everybody for your insights, your wisdom, your thoughtfulness, your honesty, and your candor. and to all of you on the line for asking some really good questions and engaging with us today. I look forward to seeing you again this week, and take care. Thanks again.